So, yeah, today we have a lot to cover, but I promise I will do my best to make it as enjoyable as possible and meaningful. And today's topic is on the providence of restoration. Another way of saying that is God's heart of determination to restore humanity. So a quick recap from what we've covered so far. In the first couple sessions, we covered, God's dream, his hope, his expectation for us, how he wanted to create this ideal kingdom through humanity fulfilling the three great blessings. And then in the last session, we covered the human fall, where we found out the story of Adam and Eve, the meaning behind the story of eating of the fruit and what that meant, how we inherited these sins and fallen natures from that original illicit relationship. And based on that, how human suffering and sin entered this world, as well as God's heartbreak. There's a passage in Genesis 6:6 where it says that God regretted that he made humanity. So we went into God's hope and God's despair. And now we want to go into God's absolute determination to fulfill his original plan. So this is what we refer to as God's providence of restoration. Here's a quote from the Divine Principle on page 82. God intended to create a world of goodness and experience from it the utmost joy. Yet due to the human fall, the world came to be filled with sin and sorrow. If this sinful world were to continue forever in its present state, then God would be an impotent and ineffectual God who failed in his creation. Therefore, God will save this sinful world by all means. So if we think about what is the purpose of history, many people think, it just is what it is, or it's pretty random. But according to principle, there is a purpose behind history. That if you look at it carefully, you can see God's hand in history working his providence of restoration. And what we mean by restoration is, and we'll go into this more later in this lecture, but the goal of restoration is ultimately to fulfill God's original purpose of creation and build the kingdom of heaven on earth. So there is an intention behind history, and the reason why it didn't go exactly as planned was because, as we introduced earlier, humans have a portion of responsibility that only we can fulfill. So God alone can't determine history. It's a combination of God's will and human responsibility that creates and fulfills God's intention. Another interesting point, if we look at biblical history, is that God was always encouraging his people. God called the chosen people of Israel out of the descendants of Abraham. He protected them, nurtured them, and at times disciplined them with tribulations and trials. God sent prophets to comfort them with the unshakable promise that one day he would send them a Messiah. So early on in biblical history, God always mentioned that he will send a Messiah that's, to continue to follow, stay obedient, and that he will send the Messiah to build his kingdom. And if we think to what is the purpose of the Messiah, why would God need to send a Messiah? The Divine Principle points out three kind of key points, which we'll come back to at the end of this presentation. The first is for people to become good object partners to God and to their restored state, they need a model, which is the Messiah. So this is really important. If you think about it, since Adam and Eve fell, from the very beginning, in their immature state, they fell away from God. So there was never a person who went the original path to become a fully matured individual. In other words, there was never in history a person who fulfilled their portion of responsibility and became a true object partner or true child of God. So the purpose of sending the Messiah is to send that model person who does resemble a completed Adam or a fully matured individual so that others can work with that figure to also become fully mature. So being a model is one of the important purposes of the Messiah. Second, Jesus came as the Messiah for nothing less than the complete salvation of humanity. So another important role of the Messiah is to provide salvation. Salvation means being saved. Saved from what? It's actually saved from sin. Since the time of the fall, unfortunately, as much as we try, we have not been able to be free of sin. So the Messiah needs to come to help provide a way through which we can actually be free of sin. Because that's not what God wanted from the very beginning. God didn't want us to have to struggle with sin. So the Messiah needs to come and provide salvation where we will be free of sin. And third, Jesus was supposed to establish the kingdom of heaven first on the earth. So again, if we understand, the Messiah is not necessarily the purpose. The purpose of the providence of restoration is the restoration of God's original ideal and the building of his kingdom. And the Messiah is a key figure to help make that a reality. So even the purpose of the Messiah is not in and of itself. In other words, sending the Messiah is not the end goal. The purpose of the Messiah is to actually build God's original kingdom here on earth as he intended. So this is the third and another very significant role of the Messiah. So today in the providence of restoration, in order to really understand how God is working through history, we need to understand some key points or key principles of restoration. So as I mentioned earlier, because of the fall, humans, we fell into a midway position under two masters. So we have, kind of like the angel on our right shoulder and the devil on our left shoulder, constantly battling and telling us, whether we should do good or evil. That's kind of the situation that we're in. The restoration through indemnity is when someone has lost his original position or state, he must make some condition to be restored to it. So what that means is, now that we've fallen into this midway position, we need to actually do something in order to restore what was lost to go back to our original state. Okay, that is the most fundamental point about restoration. It's if something's lost, it needs to be replaced or found in order to go back to the original state. And I'll give you some examples. There's 3 types of indemnity. Most common is equal indemnity. This is restoration achieved by making a condition of indemnity at a price equal to the value of what was lost. So in the Bible, it says in one verse, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Another example is like when you owe money to a friend and you pay exactly what you borrowed, that's like equal indemnity. Okay. Now there's also lesser indemnity. Restoration is achieved by making a condition of indemnity at a price less than the value of what was lost. this is like redemption through the cross. Or whenever we experience grace, it's, or, what was it? Mercy. Yeah, whenever we experience grace or mercy, that's an example of lesser indemnity, where we got more than we deserved. And again, this redemption through the cross is one example. Here's a humorous example. It says, it's his first offense. I don't know if you guys get the joke, but anyway, so yeah, that's an example of lesser indemnity. Or let's say something is forgiven, where you really owed somebody a lot, but because you apologized, let's say you bumped somebody and you damaged their bumper, but you apologize and they're like, don't worry about it, I'll take care of it. That's lesser indemnity, where you don't have to pay as much as the cost of what you lost. Okay. And then there's greater indemnity. Greater indemnity happens when a person has failed to meet a condition of lesser indemnity, and they must make another indemnity condition return to the original state, this time at a price greater than the first. Okay, and an example of that is like Abraham having to offer his son Isaac. We'll go into that story more later on in this lecture. Another example of this is foreclosure, when you fail to pay off the mortgage for your house, then they can come after the whole house. So your house might be worth more, but because you didn't pay your taxes or your loan, now the bank can actually take over the whole house. Okay, that's greater indemnity. Okay, so how about restoration through the Messiah? The divine principle states straight out that for fallen people to be restored to their original state, we must receive the Messiah. We must receive the Messiah. So since the fall of man, since we fell in an immature state, there's no way for us to directly relate with God. That's why God needed to send a Messiah through which we can humanity can reconnect to God. So the Messiah really holds a very important place. We need somebody who can represent God, who can really connect with God's heart, and also help humanity, the rest of humanity, to connect to God. And that's where salvation comes in, and that's where the hope for building God's original kingdom comes, because there's a person who can really resemble and resonate with God's heart. Now, there is a formula. Again, we talked about, the principle of both restoration and the principle of indemnity. And this is some really cool thing that was discovered and disclosed through the divine principle, and that is that in order to receive the Messiah, there needs to be a foundation of faith, which is FOF, and foundation of substance, FOS, in order to set the foundation for the Messiah. In other words, there needs to restore faith, which was lost at the time of the fall. We also need to restore love, which was lost at the time of the fall. And also through the Messiah, we need to restore lineage. Again, this is an important concept. This is, if we know what God wanted and we know what went wrong, if we want to get back to what God wanted, we need to reverse exactly what was lost at the time of the fall. Does that make sense? So if you think back to what was lost at the time of the fall, trust was lost, right? Because Adam and Eve disobeyed God, right? And also love was lost because instead of true love, false love was entered into that relationship. And also God's claim to humanity or his lineage, that was lost at the time of the fall. So all three things need to be restored in order for us to go back towards God's original ideal. Does that make sense? So this is another analogy that might help. So foundation of faith, foundation of substance is kind of like the foundation to build God's kingdom. And when you have both, then you have the foundation to receive the Messiah. So the Messiah can actually come. And then together, the Messiah and the people build the house, ultimately creating the kingdom of heaven on earth. It's just a simple analogy here. But when you have one and you don't have the other, there's not even a foundation to build God's kingdom. In other words, the Messiah can't even come. If the Messiah comes without a foundation, then the Messiah has nothing to stand on, so that kingdom will fall apart. That house will fall down. So God needs people to set this foundation of faith and substance as preparation for the Messiah to come on a solid foundation to build God's kingdom. So, what are the requirements for the foundation of faith? Well, foundation of faith, again, there's a simple formula. Basically, you need a central figure, and you need some kind of offering of faith, a conditional offering, and you need a time period that you maintain that offering. And by doing that, you can show or set a condition to restore faith in God. Okay, that's foundation of faith. That's required for foundation of faith. For foundation of substance, there needs to be unity between that central figure and those around him who are supposed to be following him or her. Also, there needs to be good conditions set to remove our fallen natures. Okay? And the point of the foundation of substance is to restore our original nature. Think about it. When we fell and we inherited the fallen natures, that was not seeing from God's viewpoint, stepping out of our position, reversing dominion, and ultimately multiplying evil. So in order for us to reverse that, we need to do the exact opposite. We need to be able to see from God's viewpoint, which is kind of like foundation of faith, and then maintain our position instead of reversing or stepping out of it, and we need to multiply goodness. So setting good conditions helps us to remove these fallen nature, replace it with our original nature. This is the essence of foundation of substance. So when we have both of these available, central figure who set the conditional offering successfully for a certain time period, and unity of those around him or her with those people, that relationship setting conditions to remove fallen nature, then the foundation for the Messiah is laid, and we're ready now to receive the Messiah. Okay, so there are some concepts here that was introduced. So I'd like to now pass it on to our facilitator for discussion time. Feel free to discuss these two questions. Why do we need a Messiah? And how do you think God feels about human history? Okay, and of course, if there was anything else that stood out to you during the presentation, feel free to discuss those as well.